There is a version of World War II that most people carry with them. It is the version with clear sides, identifiable villains, and a coherent moral arc that moves from catastrophe toward justice. It is the version taught in schools, depicted in films, commemorated on holidays. It ends with the right people winning, the guilty being punished, and the world learning something fundamental about itself. That version is not entirely false, but it is also not entirely complete. And the parts it leaves out are not minor details. They are not footnotes. They are not uncomfortable asterisks appended to an otherwise clean story. The parts that version omits are, in many cases, the very mechanisms by which the war actually functioned. They are the routines, the paperwork, the internal policies, the quiet agreements between institutions, and the slow normalization of actions that, if encountered in isolation, would have been recognized immediately as atrocities. The war was not simply a contest between good and evil. It was a contest between systems. And systems, by their nature, do not feel. They process. They document. They issue directives and receive reports and file results. And when those systems are directed toward destruction on an industrial scale, they do not become chaotic. They become more precise. What follows is not a celebration of that precision. It is not a condemnation either. It is simply an account. A record of what actually happened inside the machinery of the Second World War, as experienced by the men and women who operated that machinery, maintained it, serviced it, and in many cases were consumed by it. These are the things that soldiers came home and did not talk about. Not because they lacked language, but because language, as they understood it, had no frame for what they had seen and done. Some of them went to their graves having told no one. Some told only a priest, or a doctor, or a stranger on a train they knew they would never see again. Some of them wrote it down and then burned what they wrote. The silence was not shame in every case. Sometimes it was something more complicated than shame. Sometimes it was the simple recognition that the person they were speaking to had not been there, and that no description, however precise, would produce understanding. Only proximity could do that, and proximity was over. The first thing worth understanding is how thoroughly the war industrialized the act of killing. This sounds obvious when stated plainly. Everyone knows that modern war involves weapons and casualties, but the industrialization that happened between 1939 and 1945 was of a different order than anything that had preceded it. It was not simply that more men were killed or that more powerful weapons were used. It was that the entire process of killing was rationalized, subdivided, and distributed across institutions in a way that allowed it to proceed with minimal friction at every level. A soldier operating an artillery piece did not see the person he killed. The person who manufactured that artillery piece did not see the person it killed. The logistician who ensured the shells arrived on time did not see the person those shells killed. The officer who signed the requisition order did not see the person. The general who approved the operational plan did not see the person. And the politician who authorized the campaign did not see the person. Each individual in this chain performed a task that was, in isolation, procedurally defensible. Each could say, truthfully, that they had followed the rules as they understood them. And yet, at the end of the chain, a person was dead. Often many people were dead. And the death had been organized with the same administrative efficiency applied to any large institutional process. This was not an accident. It was a design. The distance between cause and effect was engineered into the structure of modern military institutions precisely because it reduced the psychological friction that would otherwise slow the process down. Men who could see the faces of those they killed less efficiently than men who could not. This was understood, at some level, by military planners and psychologists working on both sides of the conflict. And so systems were designed to maximize that distance wherever possible. Not always, not uniformly. There were still infantry engagements where men killed each other with their hands and with knives and with the butts of rifles. But those engagements were increasingly the exception. The dominant mode of death in World War II was administered from a distance by people who would never know the names of those they killed, and who would return from the war having technically never killed anyone they could identify. The soldiers who operated in that system understood something important. They understood that the framing of their actions as heroic or moral was external to the actions themselves. The action was the action. You loaded the gun. You pulled the trigger. You dropped the bomb. You filed the report. The meaning assigned to that action by others, by governments and newspapers and history books, was applied afterward, from the outside. The men doing the work knew only the work, and the work, stripped of its assigned meaning, was often just a series of physical processes performed under conditions of extreme stress, with the knowledge that failure to perform them correctly would result in your own death or the death of the men beside you. The cause receded. The ideology receded. What remained was the immediate physical reality of survival. This is what most soldiers, when they could be brought to speak at all, described as the dominant psychological experience of combat. Not heroism, not purpose, survival. The reduction of everything to the immediate calculus of staying alive for the next few minutes. Soldiers who had enlisted out of genuine ideological conviction, who had believed deeply in the justice of their cause, reported that this belief became increasingly abstract as combat continued. It did not disappear entirely, but it moved to the background. What moved to the foreground was the specific, tactile, sensory reality of the battlefield. The smell of it, the sounds, the physical exhaustion, the condition of your boots, whether you had eaten, whether the man beside you was still breathing. This is not a statement about the validity of the causes for which they fought. It is a statement about what combat does to the mind that engages in it continuously over months and years. It narrows the aperture. It makes the immediate overwhelmingly real and everything else increasingly theoretical. The consequence of this narrowing was that many soldiers came home having fought a war that bore very little resemblance, at the experiential level, to the war that was being described in the newspapers and commemorated in speeches. They had not experienced a crusade. They had experienced a series of specific, physical, often horrifying events, strung together over time, with no clear narrative arc at the individual level. Some of them had done things that, when recounted, would have been difficult to categorize morally, even by the most generous account. Not war crimes, necessarily, not always, but actions that existed in the space where the rules of war, the pressures of survival, and the psychological damage of prolonged combat converged in ways that produced results that did not fit cleanly into the categories of heroism or atrocity. One of the realities that received almost no public acknowledgement during or after the war was the extent to which Allied soldiers engaged in looting. This was not occasional or incidental. It was systematic, widespread, and occurred at every level of the institutional hierarchy. Individual soldiers took watches, rings, wallets, photographs, and personal items from German prisoners and from German and Japanese dead. Officers took paintings, sculptures, furniture, and other valuables from occupied homes and public buildings. Senior officers sometimes arranged for entire collections to be transported back to their home countries through official military logistics channels. The looting was so extensive that the United States Army eventually issued directives attempting to curtail it, with limited effect. The directives were issued because the behavior was recognized as problematic. But the recognition did not stop the behavior. It simply created a paper record of the attempt to stop it, which was then filed and largely forgotten. The psychological mechanism behind the looting was not primarily greed, though greed was certainly present. It was more fundamentally about the relationship between soldiers and the material world after prolonged exposure to destruction. When everything around you can be destroyed at any moment, when the landscape of a town that stood for centuries can be reduced to rubble overnight, the normal rules governing ownership and property begin to feel provisional in a way they never did in peacetime. The permanence of things is revealed as contingent, and if things can be destroyed by anyone, they can also be taken by anyone. The moral framework that normally governs the relationship between persons and property requires a stable background assumption of social order to function. In its absence, different rules emerged, not always consciously formulated, usually just enacted quietly, while the official framework looked the other way. The looting of art was particularly extensive and particularly well documented, though the documentation itself was often suppressed or minimized in post-war accounts. Both Germany and the Soviet Union operated state-sponsored programs of art seizure during the war. Germany systematically stripped occupied territories of culturally significant objects, sometimes ostensibly for safekeeping, sometimes openly as acts of cultural appropriation. The Soviet Union, in response to German seizure of Russian cultural property, conducted its own seizure operations in Germany during the final advance westward. American soldiers and officers were not operating under official seizure programs, but individual acts of acquisition were pervasive. Paintings were removed from walls and mailed home. Manuscripts were taken from archives and libraries. Objects of obvious monetary and cultural value disappeared from museums and private collections across occupied Europe, finding their way into American homes and storage facilities where many of them remain to this day, their provenance unexamined and their origin unknown to the current owners. The veterans who participated in this did not talk about it, not because they thought it was a war crime. Most of them did not think about it in those terms at all. They thought of it the way people think about most things that are technically prohibited but informally tolerated by the institution in which they operate. It was a perk. It was one of the available compensations for the discomfort and danger of the work. The moral weight of taking a painting from a French museum or a watch from a dead German soldier did not register in the context of sustained combat as something that required examination. It was simply what happened. Everyone did it. The people above you did it. The people beside you did it. And when you came home, you put the thing you had taken on a shelf, and you did not think about it very often, and when you did, you thought about it in terms of the context in which you had acquired it, rather than in terms of what it meant to the person from whom it had been taken. There is another reality that was systematically suppressed both during and after the war, and it concerns the experience of Allied prisoners in Japanese captivity. The Japanese treatment of prisoners of war violated nearly every provision of international law that governed such treatment, and the violations were not occasional lapses. They were policy. They were implemented through institutional structures, documented in internal Japanese military communications, and carried out by personnel acting under explicit or implicit authorization from their superiors. The conditions in Japanese prisoner of war camps were deliberately calibrated to produce maximum suffering and high mortality. This was not a byproduct of limited resources. Japan had adequate resources to provide minimally humane conditions. The conditions were what they were because they were designed to be what they were. The surviving prisoners returned home having experienced things that were, by any reasonable measure, as traumatic as anything experienced by survivors of the European concentration camps. Many of them were in worse physical condition than European camp survivors. The death rate among Western Allied prisoners in Japanese camps was approximately 27%. In German camps for Western Allied prisoners, it was approximately 4%. The difference is not attributable to military circumstances or resource constraints. It is attributable to policy, to decisions made by individuals in institutions about what treatment prisoners would receive, based on a combination of cultural contempt, military ideology, and explicit directives from the chain of command. The men who survived these camps came home to a society that did not, in the main, want to hear about it. The dominant post-war narrative in the United States and Britain centered on the European theater and on the liberation of Nazi camps. The Pacific experience of captivity did not fit the existing narrative frameworks very cleanly, and there were also diplomatic reasons for minimizing it. The decision to allow Emperor Hirohito to remain on the throne, to use Japanese institutional structures for the occupation and reconstruction of Japan, and to pursue a rapid normalization of relations with Japan during the Cold War period, all created political incentives to soften the public record of Japanese wartime conduct. Veterans who attempted to describe what they had experienced encountered a reception that was not openly hostile, but that was quietly discouraging. They were told in various ways that it was time to move on, that dwelling on it was not healthy, that Japan was now an ally. The result was a generation of men who carried those experiences in silence for decades, and who in many cases died without having ever spoken about them publicly. The physical condition of returning Pacific prisoners was severe. Many of them suffered from malnutrition-related diseases that produced permanent physiological damage. Beriberi, pellagra, scurvy, and various parasitic infections left lasting effects on the cardiovascular system, the nervous system, and the digestive system. Men who had been healthy and physically capable when they entered captivity returned home as shadows of their former selves, aged by a decade or more in the span of a few years. The Veterans Administration, which was responsible for providing medical care and compensation to returning veterans, was not well equipped to handle the specific medical presentations associated with prolonged captivity and malnutrition. Many former prisoners were evaluated by physicians who had no experience with these conditions and who underestimated or misattributed the severity of their physical damage. Compensation claims were denied or minimized. Medical care was inadequate, and the men who had survived the camps were left to manage, largely on their own, the physical and psychological consequences of what had been done to them. The psychological consequences were equally severe and equally inadequately addressed. Post-traumatic stress as a clinical concept did not exist in its current form during this period. Veterans with severe psychological symptoms were often diagnosed with conditions like anxiety, neurosis, or combat fatigue, diagnoses that carried implicit suggestions of weakness and that were poorly understood and poorly treated by the medical establishment of the era. Men who could not sleep, who had nightmares, who experienced dissociative episodes, who were prone to violent outbursts, who could not maintain stable employment or relationships, were often told by physicians that they needed to pull themselves together and get on with things. The culture of the period did not provide a legitimate framework for male psychological suffering. The expectation was that soldiers would return, resume their lives, and integrate their wartime experiences into a general narrative of service and sacrifice. The expectation had nothing to do with the actual psychological reality of prolonged combat exposure or captivity. The families of these men absorbed the consequences. The elevated rates of domestic violence, alcoholism, suicide, and family dissolution among veterans in the post-war period are well documented in statistical records, though they were rarely discussed as veteran issues at the time. They were categorized as personal failures, as individual moral or behavioral problems, rather than as systemic consequences of what these men had experienced and how poorly the system had prepared them for it or supported them through it. The children of these veterans grew up in households shaped by trauma that was never named as such and therefore never addressed. The pattern repeated itself across generations in ways that were not fully recognized or understood until decades later, when researchers began examining the long-term effects of untreated combat trauma on family systems. The reality of Allied bombing campaigns over Germany and Japan is another area where the official record and the lived experience diverged substantially. The strategic bombing campaign waged by Britain and the United States against German cities was, at the level of policy, a deliberate decision to target civilian infrastructure and civilian populations. This decision was not made secretly or in violation of official policy. It was made openly, argued for on strategic grounds, and implemented through the institutional machinery of the Allied air forces with full authorization from the highest levels of government. The argument was that destroying German industrial capacity and undermining civilian morale would shorten the war. The validity of this argument remained contested among military planners throughout the war and has been contested by historians ever since. But the argument was made, accepted, and acted upon. The result was that Allied aircraft dropped millions of tons of explosives on German cities, killing somewhere between 300,000 and 600,000 German civilians, depending on the methodology used to calculate the figure. Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, Dusseldorf, and dozens of other cities were reduced to rubble. Hamburg alone, in a series of raids in the summer of 1943, killed somewhere between 35,000 and 45,000 people in approximately a week. The firestorm created by the incendiary bombing of Hamburg reached temperatures high enough to melt asphalt and to create winds strong enough to pull people off their feet and into the flames. People in underground shelters suffocated as the fire consumed the available oxygen. Others were found afterward in the basements where they had taken refuge, reduced to small piles of ash by temperatures that exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius. These were not soldiers. They were not war production workers. They were the entire civilian population of a large city, distributed across the ordinary geography of daily life, killed by a decision made in a conference room in London. The airmen who flew these missions knew, at some level of abstraction, what they were doing. But the knowledge was managed in the same way that knowledge was managed throughout the war machine, through distance, through specialization, through the procedural framing of each mission as a military objective. The target was a city, but the target was described in briefings as rail yards, as industrial facilities, as military production centers. The fact that these objectives were embedded in dense civilian urban areas, and that the available precision of aerial bombing made it impossible to strike the objective without killing vast numbers of people living around it, was present in the planning documents and known to the planners. It was simply accepted as an operational reality and folded into the institutional calculus. The airmen themselves did not, in most cases, see the results of their work. They dropped their bombs from altitudes of thousands of feet, turned around and flew home. The feedback loop was broken. The gap between action and consequence was as wide as it was for any other part of the killing machine. Debriefings focused on operational performance. Did the bombs hit the intended target area? What was the flak like? Were there fighters? What was the condition of the aircraft? The question of what happened to the people below was not part of the debrief. It was not part of the institutional vocabulary that governed the experience of being an airman in the strategic bombing campaign. And so most of those airmen came home having killed thousands of people by the aggregate mathematics of their missions, without ever having engaged in anything that their institutional context categorized as killing. The ones who thought about it found that it did not feel like killing. It felt like something else. Something for which there was no established word. They had performed a technical task, under dangerous conditions, in service of an objective that was handed to them by an institutional chain of command. The moral weight of that task, if any weight attached to it, was distributed so diffusely across the system that it was effectively invisible at the individual level. This is not a defense of the bombing campaigns. It is a description of the psychological reality of participating in them and of how institutional design can enable individuals to participate in acts of mass destruction without experiencing the psychological consequences that such participation would produce if the relationship between actor and consequence were direct. The situation in the Pacific bombing campaign was, if anything, even more extreme. The decision to firebomb Japanese cities, made by General Curtis LeMay and approved at the highest levels of American military and political leadership, was based on an explicit calculation that incendiary bombing of Japanese urban areas, which were largely constructed of wood, would be more efficient than high-explosive bombing of industrial facilities. The word efficient is the operative word here. The objective was to maximize destruction per unit of cost, where cost was measured in aircraft, fuel, and bomb tonnage. The destruction being maximized was of human settlement. The metric was efficiency. The bureaucratic language was industrial. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945, killed somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people in a single night. It was by any measure one of the deadliest single military operations of the war, comparable to the atomic bombings that followed it. The aircraft involved were B-29 bombers, each carrying incendiary cluster bombs. They flew in low, under 10,000 feet, in order to improve accuracy. The fires they started merged into a single conflagration that consumed 16 square miles of the city. People in the Sumida River, who had jumped in to escape the flames, were boiled alive by the heat. The smell of burning reached the crews of the aircraft flying above and behind the lead formation. This was documented in after-action reports. The smell was recorded as notable. It was recorded alongside operational details like flight altitude, bomb load, and target coordinates. It was one data point among many. This campaign continued for months. Tokyo was bombed again. Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, and dozens of smaller Japanese cities were subjected to similar attacks. By August of 1945, before the atomic bombs were dropped, American firebombing had already killed more Japanese civilians than died at Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. This is not a widely known or frequently cited fact. The atomic bombings ended the war and occupied a particular place in the moral and political consciousness of the post-war period that the firebombing campaigns did not. The atomic bombs were discrete events with specific dates and locations and a narrative role in the war's ending. The firebombing was a campaign, distributed across months, carried out by ordinary aircraft with conventional weapons, producing cumulative casualties that exceeded those of the weapons that became the defining moral crisis of the nuclear age. The distribution made it easier to process institutionally. The statistics were in the reports. The reports were filed. The campaign continued. There is a dimension of the war that is almost never discussed in popular accounts, and it concerns the experience of killing at close range and what it did to the men who did it repeatedly over time. The psychological research that emerged after the war, and that was built upon extensively in subsequent conflicts, revealed something that military planners had understood instinctively for centuries, but had never formally documented. Most people, in most circumstances, find it extremely difficult to kill another human being at close range. The difficulty is not primarily physical, it is psychological. There is something in the human nervous system that resists the act of taking another human life when the other human being is close enough to be recognized as a human being. This resistance manifests as hesitation, as inaccuracy, as the instinct to wound rather than kill, and in some cases as a complete inability to fire a weapon at all, even under conditions of direct personal threat. Studies of infantry combat in World War II, conducted after the war by military psychologists examining after-action reports and interviewing veterans, suggested that the effective firing rates among infantry soldiers in combat were substantially lower than the theoretical maximum their numbers and armament should have produced. A significant proportion of soldiers in a given engagement were not firing their weapons, or were firing them in directions unlikely to hit anything, even when they were under direct fire themselves. The resistance to killing that this pattern suggested was not cowardice. The same soldiers were performing their other duties, were maintaining their positions under fire, were operating effectively in every way that did not involve aiming a weapon at another human being and pulling the trigger. The military establishment did not discuss this research publicly after the war. It was classified. Its implications were studied, and those implications were incorporated into changes in infantry training that were implemented in the Korean War and expanded further in Vietnam. The changes were designed to reduce the psychological resistance to killing by desensitizing soldiers to it during training, by dehumanizing the target through the use of silhouette targets rather than bullseye targets, and by creating conditioned reflexes that would bypass the conscious deliberative process entirely. The effectiveness of these training modifications was measurable in the increased effective firing rates observed in subsequent conflicts. The military had, through institutional experimentation, found a way to override a fundamental human inhibition, and it had done this quietly, without public acknowledgement, and without any systematic consideration of what the long-term psychological effects on the soldiers so trained would be. The soldiers who did kill at close range repeatedly and who found that the resistance either did not exist in them or was overcome by circumstances carried that knowledge in a particular way. There is a small subset of veterans from every conflict who killed effectively at close range, who operated efficiently in the most direct and personal mode of combat, and who came home having done something that the culture around them had no framework for processing. They could not talk about it as heroism, because heroism has a certain quality of celebration attached to it, and what they had experienced was not celebratory. They could not talk about it as atrocity, because atrocity implies transgression of accepted norms, and they had operated within the norms of their institutional context. They had done what they were told. They had done it well, and the doing of it had left a residue in their nervous systems that did not have a name, and that would not receive a name for decades. The experience of combat in the Pacific Theater had dimensions that were particular to that geographic and cultural context, and that produced psychological outcomes that differed in important ways from the European theater. The fighting in the Pacific Islands was, at the infantry level, among the most brutal and sustained close-quarters combat of the entire war. The terrain, the climate, the disease environment, and the tactical circumstances produced conditions of extended physical and psychological extremity that had few equivalents in the European theater. Men fought in jungle environments where visibility was measured in feet rather than miles, where the enemy could be within a few meters without being visible, where the heat and humidity and insects and disease degraded physical capacity continuously, and where the lines between military engagement and simple survival were completely blurred. The racial dimension of the Pacific War is also something that received almost no honest public examination during or after the conflict. Both sides dehumanized the other in ways that were systematic and institutionally supported, and the dehumanization had real consequences for how the war was fought and how prisoners were treated. American propaganda depicting the Japanese enemy was explicitly racial in ways that European enemy propaganda was not, or at least not uniformly. Japanese soldiers were depicted as subhuman in popular media, in military training materials, and in the rhetoric of senior military and political leaders. This depiction was not incidental. It was functional. It made the killing easier by providing a cultural and institutional framework that placed the enemy outside the category of persons who activated the psychological resistance to killing. The consequence was that certain behaviors that would have been categorized as war crimes in the European theater were treated as unremarkable in the Pacific. The taking of trophies from Japanese dead was pervasive. Ears, fingers, and skulls were taken by American soldiers and sent home to family members who kept them on mantelpieces and in display cases. This was not secret. It was reported in newspapers. There are documented cases of American newspapers publishing photographs of women posing with Japanese skulls sent by their husbands or boyfriends serving in the Pacific. The practice was so widespread that General Douglas MacArthur at one point issued a directive attempting to stop it, though the directive had limited effect. The killing of Japanese prisoners was also common. The surrender rate among Japanese forces was extremely low throughout the Pacific campaign, and the standard interpretation is that Japanese military culture treated surrender as dishonorable. This is accurate. But it is also true that American soldiers frequently killed Japanese soldiers who attempted to surrender, and that this was known and broadly tolerated by the military hierarchy. The killing of surrendering soldiers is a war crime under international law. The practice was widespread enough that it appears in memoirs, letters, and post-war interviews with veterans. It was not exceptional. It was another of the routines that the war produced, embedded in the specific context of Pacific combat, and processed by the institutional machinery as an operational reality rather than as a legal or moral problem. The German treatment of Soviet prisoners of war is one of the most extensively documented large-scale atrocities of the war, and yet it remains poorly integrated into popular understanding of the conflict. Of the approximately 5.5 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany during the war, roughly 3.5 million were dead by the end of 1941 and early 1942. This was not the result of combat. These were men who had already been captured. They were killed in captivity through starvation, exposure, disease, and deliberate execution in a period of less than a year. The scale of this mortality is comparable to the Holocaust in terms of raw numbers over the relevant time period, and it was similarly the result of deliberate institutional decisions made at the highest levels of German military and political leadership. The decision to treat Soviet prisoners as subhuman was ideological. It was grounded in Nazi racial theory, in the characterization of Slavic peoples as Untermenschen, as subhumans who did not merit the protections that international law and military convention required for prisoners of war. But it was also operationalized through institutions. It was implemented through directives issued by the Wehrmacht High Command, through orders transmitted down the military hierarchy, through the establishment of camps that were designed not to hold prisoners, but to kill them. The men who ran these camps were not members of the SS or the concentration camp system. They were regular army officers. The Wehrmacht, the conventional German military force that post-war German society and many Allied historians chose to distinguish from the Nazi political apparatus, was directly responsible for the deaths of millions of Soviet prisoners. This was documented in captured German military records after the war and was known to Allied authorities. It was not the focus of the Nuremberg prosecutions, which centered primarily on the political and SS leadership. The Wehrmacht's institutional responsibility for the murder of prisoners was effectively set aside. The reason it was set aside was, again, political and strategic. The Western Allies wanted to rebuild Germany as a functioning democratic state and as a bulwark against Soviet expansion during the emerging Cold War. Prosecuting the entire officer corps of the German military for their role in the prisoner murders would have made this reconstruction vastly more difficult. And so a distinction was drawn, largely artificial but politically necessary, between the Nazi political apparatus and the professional military. The professional military was retrospectively absolved of institutional responsibility. Individual officers who could be linked to specific documented crimes were prosecuted. The institutional responsibility of the Wehrmacht as an organization was not prosecuted, and the surviving officers of that organization were available, and many of them were used to staff the new West German military that was created in 1955 as part of the NATO alliance structure. The men who had run the prisoner camps, who had administered the system that killed 3.5 million people in a matter of months, went home, in most cases, and resumed their lives. Some of them became businessmen, some became local officials, some worked in the new German military. They were not unusual men. That is the part that is difficult to look at directly. They were not selected for sadism or exceptional cruelty. They were selected for competence, for the ability to manage large administrative operations efficiently. They administered the killing of Soviet prisoners the way they had administered everything else in their institutional careers, as a management problem requiring efficient solutions. The killing was the policy. They managed the implementation. The war also produced a set of medical and scientific realities that were suppressed partly out of shame and partly out of the recognition that the information itself was too useful to the post-war military scientific establishment to permit to remain contaminated by its origins. The Japanese Unit 731 conducted biological weapons research on prisoners of war and civilians in Manchuria throughout the war. The research involved deliberate infection of prisoners with plague, cholera, typhoid, and other diseases, vivisection without anesthesia, freezing experiments designed to study frostbite and test treatments, pressure experiments, and a range of other procedures on living human subjects. The scale of the operation was extensive. The documentation was thorough. The results were scientifically valuable in the specific sense that they generated data about biological agents and human physiological responses that could not have been generated through ethical research methods. After the war, American military and intelligence officials became aware of the existence of this research. The decision was made at a senior level to offer immunity from war crimes prosecution to the personnel of Unit 731 in exchange for the research data. The data was transferred to American military medical research institutions. The men who had conducted the experiments, who had killed thousands of people in the process of conducting them, were never prosecuted. They returned to civilian life in Japan. Many of them had successful post-war careers in medicine, academia, and industry. The commander of Unit 731, Shiro Ishii, died in 1959 of throat cancer, never having been prosecuted for any of his activities. The American government's role in the immunity arrangement was not publicly acknowledged until decades after the events, and the full documentary record of the arrangement has never been fully released. The German medical experiments conducted at Auschwitz and other concentration camps produced similar data acquisition dilemmas. Some of the physiological data generated by Nazi medical experiments was used in post-war aerospace medicine research, specifically data on human responses to extreme cold and low oxygen conditions generated through experiments that killed the subjects. The use of this data was debated within the scientific community, and there were scientists who refused to use it on moral grounds. But there were also scientists who used it, and the products of that research, the safety standards and medical protocols that were developed using it, were incorporated into post-war aviation and space medicine in ways that are difficult to fully trace or disentangle. The moral question of whether scientific data generated through atrocity can or should be used remains unresolved. It was not resolved after World War II. It was simply set aside. The data was used where it was useful, and the question of its origins was managed through institutional compartmentalization. The people using the data in the 1950s and 1960s were often not the people who had acquired it. They received it through institutional channels, as data, stripped of the context that would have made its origins immediately visible. The distance between origin and use was sufficient in most cases to allow the process to proceed without what would otherwise have been an intolerable level of institutional discomfort. The treatment of black soldiers in the American military during World War II is another reality that was systematically suppressed in the dominant post-war narrative of the war as a struggle for freedom and democracy. The United States military was rigorously segregated throughout the war. Black soldiers served in separate units, under white officers in most cases, with fewer material resources, less prestigious assignments, and significantly less favorable treatment in every measurable dimension. They were excluded from most combat roles in the early part of the war, assigned instead to logistics and support functions. When they did serve in combat roles, their performance was frequently minimized or erased from official accounts. The institutional racism of the military was not incidental to the war effort. It was structural. It was built into the administrative systems that governed assignment, promotion, discipline, and resource allocation. Black soldiers faced a particular double reality. They were fighting theoretically for the freedom and democracy of peoples who were being oppressed by fascist governments. They were doing this while being institutionally subjected to a system of racial separation and legal inequality in their own country that shared certain structural features with the racial ideologies they were nominally fighting against. This was not lost on them. The Double V campaign, which circulated in the black press during the war, expressed the goal of victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. The campaign was considered subversive by military intelligence and was monitored accordingly. Black veterans returning from the war encountered a reception that was, in many places, actively hostile. In the American South, veterans in uniform were subject to violence and intimidation that was sometimes organized by local law enforcement. There are documented cases of returning black veterans in military uniform being beaten or killed within days or weeks of their return. The federal government's response to these incidents was minimal. The political incentives that governed federal behavior in the South in the immediate post-war period did not favor vigorous enforcement of the rights of black veterans. And so men who had served honorably in the military, who had fought and in some cases been wounded in the service of their country, returned home to find that the institutional system had no mechanism for converting their service into the social standing or legal protection that it would have provided to a white veteran. The GI Bill, which transformed the economic and social landscape of post-war America by providing veterans with access to low-cost mortgages, college education, and other benefits, operated in practice as a racially discriminatory program. The administration of the GI Bill was delegated largely to state and local agencies and private institutions, which applied it according to the racial norms of their own contexts. Black veterans were denied mortgages in the same suburban developments that white veterans were moving into. Black veterans were turned away from the universities that white veterans were attending. The institutional design of the bill allowed its discriminatory application without requiring explicit racial language in the federal legislation itself. The discrimination was effected through delegation to local institutions that were already structured by racial hierarchy. The result was that the GI Bill, which in the aggregate produced one of the most significant expansions of the American middle class in the country's history, did so in a way that systematically excluded black veterans from participation in that expansion. The wealth gap between black and white Americans that persists to the present day was substantially widened by the differential application of post-war veteran benefits. This is documented in the historical record. It is available in the archives of the institutions that administered the benefits, in the records of the banks that denied the mortgages, and in the records of the universities that refused the applications. It is simply not part of the story that most Americans tell themselves about what the GI Bill was, or what it did. The sexual violence perpetrated by soldiers of all major military forces during World War II is another reality that was comprehensively suppressed in post-war accounts. Sexual violence in war is not incidental. It is not the behavior of exceptional individuals who deviate from institutional norms. It is, in varying degrees and with varying levels of institutional tolerance or endorsement, a normal feature of military occupation. This was as true in World War II as in any other major conflict, and the evidence is extensive. The rape of Nanking in 1937, which falls in the period immediately preceding the declared start of the war but is continuous with it, involved the systematic rape of an estimated 20,000 to 80,000 Chinese women by Japanese soldiers over a period of 6 weeks. This was not chaotic or spontaneous. It occurred in the context of a deliberate military campaign that included mass execution of prisoners and civilians. The rapes were documented by Western observers who were present in the city at the time, including diplomats, missionaries, and journalists. Japanese soldiers who participated described their actions in letters home and in post-war testimonies. The institutional response of the Japanese military to the rape of Nanking was not to stop it. It was to attempt to manage it by establishing a system of military brothels, so-called comfort stations, that would channel the sexual violence through institutional structures rather than permitting it to continue in its uncontrolled form. The comfort station system was itself a form of institutionalized sexual slavery. Women from Korea, China, the Philippines, and other occupied territories were recruited through deception, through direct coercion, and through economic desperation manufactured by the conditions of occupation. They were assigned to military units, transported with those units, and required to serve as soldiers on a schedule dictated by military administrative procedures. The number of women subjected to this system is disputed, but estimates range from 50,000 to as many as 200,000. The Japanese government's acknowledgement of and apology for this system has been inconsistent and contested over the decades since the war, and the issue remains a source of significant diplomatic tension between Japan and its neighbors. The sexual violence perpetrated by Soviet soldiers during the advance through Eastern Europe and into Germany at the end of the war was also massive in scale. The rape of German women by Soviet soldiers during the final stages of the war in Europe and the immediate post-war occupation is estimated to have involved somewhere between 1 and 2 million victims. This estimate is derived from hospital records, birth records, and testimonies collected in the decades after the events. The Soviet military command was aware of the scope of the violence. Some Soviet officers attempted to stop it, others participated in it. The institutional response at the highest levels was effectively permissive. Stalin's reported comment when informed that Soviet soldiers were raping German women, which was something along the lines that soldiers who had experienced what they had experienced should be allowed to have some fun, may or may not be historically accurate in its precise wording, but it accurately captures the institutional posture of the Soviet military leadership toward the conduct of its soldiers in Germany. The rape of German women by Allied soldiers, including American and British soldiers, was also pervasive, though at a substantially lower scale than the Soviet campaign. The American military prosecuted soldiers for rape during and after the war, and there are documented cases in which soldiers were executed for the crime. But the prosecutions were not comprehensive, and there is substantial evidence that the actual incidence of sexual violence by American soldiers was vastly higher than the prosecution rate suggested. The rate at which rape charges were prosecuted and the rate at which prosecutions resulted in execution or significant punishment was influenced by the race of the perpetrator and the victim in ways that reflected the racial hierarchies of the institution. Black American soldiers were disproportionately represented among those prosecuted and executed for rape in the European theater, in proportions that significantly exceeded their share of the American military population. The reconstruction of European society after the war required the suppression of substantial amounts of information about what had happened during the occupation and liberation periods. The women who had been raped did not speak about it publicly in most cases. In Germany, silence about the rapes was partly a function of shame and partly a practical response to the post-war social environment in which women's survival and social standing depended on managing information about their wartime experiences. Women who had had relationships, however coerced, with German soldiers or occupation officials faced social stigma. Women who had been raped faced a different kind of stigma. Women who had survived by whatever means available in the context of total war and occupation faced a social world that was not equipped to process or acknowledge the range of experiences that survival had required. And so the silence settled, and the records that would have documented the full scale of the violence were incomplete, or were not kept, or were not preserved. The experience of German civilians at the end of the war and in the immediate post-war period is another dimension of the conflict that received minimal attention in the dominant Allied post-war narrative. The expulsion of ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe in the period from 1944 to 1950 involved somewhere between 12 and 14 million people and resulted in an estimated 500,000 to 2 million deaths. This was the largest forced population movement in European history up to that point. It was conducted with the explicit approval of the Allied governments, codified in the Potsdam Agreement of 1945, which authorized the transfer of German populations from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary to the occupied zones of Germany. The agreement specified that the transfer should be orderly and humane. It was neither. The expulsions were accompanied by extensive violence, theft, forced labor, and the conditions of the transfers, conducted in winter, without adequate food, water, or shelter, killed a substantial proportion of those being expelled. The survivors arrived in a Germany that was itself on the edge of famine, had lost much of its housing stock to bombing, and was being administered by 4 separate occupation authorities with different policies and different levels of interest in the welfare of the population. The winter of 1946 and 1947 was particularly severe, and food rations in the occupation zones were, at various points, at levels that produced clinical malnutrition in portions of the German civilian population. The occupying powers were aware of the mortality implications of the food situation. The extent to which the mortality was acceptable or even desired as part of a broader policy of weakening Germany was a matter of debate within and between the Allied governments. The Morgenthau Plan, proposed by American Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau in 1944, had called for the permanent deindustrialization of Germany and its conversion into an agricultural economy. The plan was adopted in modified form in the Joint Chiefs of Staff Directive, JCS 1067, which governed American occupation policy in Germany from 1945 to 1947. JCS 1067 prohibited occupation authorities from taking steps to revive the German economy above a subsistence level. The directive was eventually superseded by the Marshall Plan and the emerging Cold War logic that required a rebuilt Germany as an economic and military asset against the Soviet Union. But in the period from 1945 to 1947, American occupation policy was explicitly designed to prevent German economic recovery, with consequences for the civilian population that were known and accepted as a matter of policy. None of this is to suggest an equivalence between what Germany did and what was done to Germany after the war. The moral asymmetry between the causes and consequences of German aggression and the hardships imposed on German civilians during and after the occupation is not difficult to calculate. But the calculation of asymmetry does not eliminate the facts. The German civilians who died of cold and hunger in the winter of 1946 were dead. The methods by which they died involved institutional decisions made by governing authorities who had the means to prevent those deaths and chose not to. The framing of those deaths as a consequence of war rather than as a consequence of policy is a choice about how to categorize the same set of facts. The facts remain the same regardless of the category. The collaboration of civilian populations with German occupation throughout Europe is another reality that the post-war narrative managed through selective emphasis and institutional amnesia. In France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, and throughout the occupied territories, significant portions of the civilian population collaborated with German occupation authorities in ways that ranged from passive accommodation to active participation in the persecution of Jews and other targeted groups. The extent of this collaboration varied significantly by country and by the nature of the occupation regime, but it was universal. And in most occupied countries it involved a significant minority, sometimes approaching a majority, of the population engaging in some form of cooperative relationship with the occupying power. The post-war management of the collaboration record was handled differently in different countries, but the common thread was a tendency to minimize the scope of collaboration and to maximize the narrative role of resistance. Resistance was real. It existed in every occupied country and involved genuine courage and genuine sacrifice. But it was statistically marginal. The people who actively resisted German occupation were a small minority of the population. The people who went about their lives while accommodating the occupation in whatever ways were necessary for daily survival were the majority. And among that majority, a substantial number did more than accommodate. They informed, they participated, they benefited. The Dutch case is particularly well documented. The Netherlands had, before the war, a well-functioning administrative state with detailed records of its population, including religious affiliation. The German occupation used these records to identify Jews for deportation with a thoroughness and efficiency that was exceptional, even by the standards of the German occupation administration. Dutch officials and Dutch police cooperated extensively with the German authorities in the administration and enforcement of anti-Jewish measures. The deportation of Dutch Jews to the camps was executed with an efficiency that resulted in a Jewish death rate in the Netherlands of approximately 75%, among the highest in Western Europe. This high death rate was in significant part a function of the cooperation of Dutch institutions and Dutch officials with the German deportation program. This was known in the Netherlands after the war. It was documented. And for decades, it was managed through a combination of selective prosecution, deliberate amnesia, and a national narrative that emphasized Dutch resistance and Dutch victimhood and minimized Dutch complicity. The Dutch resistance narrative was not false. There were Dutch people who resisted, who hid Jews, who operated underground networks, who were captured and tortured and killed. Anne Frank's family was hidden by Dutch people at enormous personal risk, but the family was also eventually found and reported to German authorities by Dutch informers. Both of these things are true. The national narrative chose to center one of them. The same pattern, with variations, appeared in France, in Belgium, in Norway, and in the other occupied countries. It appeared in the post-war treatment of those who had collaborated and those who had resisted. The people who had collaborated were, in the immediate post-war period, subject to popular justice that was itself often brutal and poorly targeted. Women who had had sexual relationships with German soldiers had their heads shaved and were paraded through streets. Men who had worked for German occupation administrations were sometimes killed without trial. But the institutional collaborators, the officials and police and businessmen who had cooperated with German authorities at the institutional level, were largely processed through systems that were designed to produce a manageable number of prosecutions and a rapid restoration of normal institutional functioning. The priority was not justice, it was normalization. The institutions needed to function. The people who knew how to run them were, in many cases, the same people who had been running them under German authority. The rapid normalization of German industry after the war followed a similar logic. German industrial corporations that had used slave labor from concentration camps during the war, that had in some cases operated production facilities adjacent to the camps and drawn their workforce from the camp populations, that had profited from the labor of people who were simultaneously being killed in industrial processes within the same institutional complex, were rehabilitated into functioning German companies during the occupation period. Their executives were prosecuted in some cases through the successor Nuremberg proceedings. But the companies themselves were not liquidated. They were restructured, reformed, and in many cases returned to the management of people who had been complicit in their wartime operations. The logic was the same logic that governed all post-war reconstruction decisions. The institutions needed to function. The priority was normalization. The question of what those institutions had done was processed through a legal mechanism that produced a defined set of prosecutions, a defined set of verdicts, and a defined endpoint at which the accounting was considered complete and the institutions could move forward. The camps that the Germans built for the Einsatzgruppen operations in the Soviet Union, the pits and ravines where mass shootings were carried out, were not part of the industrial killing system of the major extermination camps. They were a different mode of industrial killing. Mobile killing units, composed of police battalions and SS personnel, but also including regular Wehrmacht units on various occasions, moved through the occupied Soviet territories conducting mass shootings of Jewish populations, communist officials, and others designated for elimination. The most documented of these sites is Babi Yar, the ravine outside Kiev, where approximately 33,700 Jewish civilians were shot over 2 days in September 1941. This operation was documented in the operational reports of the units involved, which were captured after the war and which described the operation with the bureaucratic precision that characterized German military record-keeping throughout the conflict. Numbers of persons processed, dates, locations, quantities of ammunition expended. The men who conducted these operations were not, for the most part, selected for their ideological extremism or their personal sadism. Research conducted after the war on the composition and psychology of the units involved suggests that they were ordinary men, drawn from ordinary backgrounds, given an assignment, given the institutional authority and the institutional context that defined the assignment as legitimate. And they performed the assignment. Research by historian Christopher Browning on Reserve Police Battalion 101, which participated in mass killings in Poland, found that the men of the battalion had been given the option, by their commanding officer, to opt out of the killings if they found them too difficult. Very few did. The opt-out was not exercised because the institutional and social pressures within the unit made non-participation a form of deviance rather than a form of compliance. The default setting of the institution was killing. Participation was normal. Opting out required an act of individual assertion against the institutional norm that most people, in most circumstances, do not make. This is not an exculpation. It is an explanation. The two are different. The explanation matters because it tells us something about the conditions under which ordinary people participate in extraordinary atrocities. The conditions are institutional. The conditions are social. The conditions are the product of systems that assign meaning to actions and distribute moral weight across enough participants that no individual feels the full weight of what the system is doing. This is not a lesson specific to World War II. It is a description of how large institutional systems function when directed toward destruction. The war demonstrated, at a scale and with a documentation that has no precedent, what those systems are capable of. The Allied liberation of the concentration camps in the spring of 1945 produced responses in the liberating soldiers that were, in many cases, as psychologically damaging in their own way as anything else they had experienced in the war. The camps presented a form of evidence about human institutional capacity that had no prior framework in the experience of the men who encountered them. They had been fighting a war that, however brutal, had operated within recognizable parameters. Mass death was familiar. Destruction was familiar. The camps were something else. They were evidence of a sustained, methodical, institutionally organized project of destruction that had been running in parallel with the war for years, that had consumed millions of people, and that had been integrated into the administrative and logistical machinery of a modern industrial state as seamlessly as any other large institutional program. The soldiers who liberated the camps were ordered by their commanders to document what they found. This was a deliberate decision. General Eisenhower, who visited the camps personally, ordered extensive photographic and film documentation of the conditions and the dead specifically, because he anticipated that the evidence would be disbelieved or denied in the future. He ordered local German civilians from nearby towns to be marched through the camps so that they would be unable to claim ignorance. The documentation produced is the basis of the photographic record that has anchored the public understanding of the Holocaust ever since. It exists because of an institutional decision to create it, made by a man who understood that without deliberate preservation, the evidence might not survive in a form that could compel belief. The reaction of the liberating soldiers themselves was not uniform and not simple. Some were enraged. Some were sickened into a catatonic state. Some channeled the experience into immediate retribution against camp guards and SS personnel who were captured in the vicinity of the camps, killings that were extrajudicial and that were reported in some cases but not prosecuted, because the institutional will to pursue such prosecutions did not exist in the context of what the camps had demonstrated. Some soldiers retained the images they had seen as persistent visual memories that did not fade with time, that surfaced in dreams and in involuntary flashbacks for the rest of their lives. Some came home and found that they could not describe what they had seen to their families or to anyone else in terms that produced understanding, and retreated into silence. The German civilians who were marched through the camps by Eisenhower's order responded in ways that were also not uniform. Some wept. Some expressed what appeared to be genuine shock. Some maintained expressions of blank incomprehension. Some vomited. Some fainted. Some walked through without visible reaction, either because they had, at some level, already known, or because the scale of what they were being shown exceeded the capacity of immediate emotional response. The question of what ordinary Germans knew about the camps and the killing program during the war is historically contested and likely cannot be fully resolved. The logistical scale of the deportation operations, which moved millions of people through public transportation networks in full view of the civilian population, the circulation of information through letters and conversations and rumors, and the documented involvement of German civilian institutions in various phases of the persecution program, all suggest that the claim of complete ignorance was, at the aggregate level, not credible. At the individual level, the degree of specific knowledge varied enormously. What most people knew was partial, filtered, and managed in accordance with the psychological need to not know things that would make continued normal functioning impossible. This management of knowledge, the active maintenance of not knowing in the face of available information, is another of the war's realities that resists simple categorization. It was not lying. It was not even, in most cases, conscious. It was the operation of a psychological mechanism that human beings use when the full weight of available information would be unbearable. The mechanism is functional. It allows people to continue functioning in circumstances that would otherwise be paralyzing. It is also, in the circumstances of the Holocaust, implicated in the continuation of the killing, because the not knowing of the civilian population was one of the conditions that allowed the institutional killing to proceed without the kind of social friction that might have complicated it. After the formal end of the war, the Allied occupation governments faced a problem that was immense in scale and deeply resistant to the institutional tools available for addressing it. They had to process the wartime conduct of an entire nation, identify and prosecute those responsible for the worst crimes, and simultaneously rebuild the administrative and economic infrastructure of a functioning state from the wreckage of a destroyed one. These two objectives were in tension with each other. The prosecution objective pointed toward comprehensive accounting of institutional responsibility. The reconstruction objective pointed toward the rapid rehabilitation of institutional personnel who could make the reconstruction work. The tension was resolved in practice almost entirely in favor of reconstruction. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted 24 senior Nazi leaders and resulted in 12 death sentences, 7 prison sentences, and 3 acquittals. The successor proceedings at Nuremberg prosecuted additional defendants from the military, the judiciary, the medical profession, the industrial sector, and the SS. In total, the Nuremberg process produced approximately 200 convictions. Against the scale of the crime, against the millions of deaths and the hundreds of thousands of perpetrators at various levels of the institutional hierarchy, the numbers are strikingly small. They were small by design because the alternative, a comprehensive accounting of institutional responsibility, was operationally impossible in the context of post-war reconstruction. The denazification process that was supposed to identify and remove former Nazis from positions of institutional authority in post-war Germany was extensive on paper and largely ineffective in practice. Millions of Germans were required to complete questionnaires documenting their wartime affiliations. The questionnaires produced millions of records. The records were reviewed by boards that were understaffed, underfunded, and operating under time pressure. The vast majority of cases were categorized as minor participants or nominal members, categories that carried limited or no professional consequences. Former Nazis were classified as fellow travelers, fined nominal amounts, and allowed to resume their careers. The German judiciary, the German civil service, the German university system, and German industry in the 1950s and 1960s contained significant numbers of people who had participated in the Nazi system at various levels, whose participation was a matter of record in the denazification files, and who had been classified and cleared in ways that allowed them to resume normal institutional functions. The Gehlen organization, which became the core of the West German intelligence service, was built explicitly on the personnel and operational networks of German military intelligence from the war. General Reinhard Gehlen had been chief of German military intelligence for the Eastern Front during the war. His organization had conducted operations that were intertwined with the worst atrocities of the Eastern Campaign. After the war, Gehlen surrendered to American forces and offered his files and his network in exchange for institutional protection. The offer was accepted. Gehlen and his personnel were transferred to American intelligence control and eventually established as the core of what would become the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the West German Federal Intelligence Service. The organization recruited personnel who had served in the Gestapo, the SD, and other elements of the Nazi security apparatus. This was known to American intelligence authorities, who accepted it as a necessary operational trade-off in the context of Cold War competition with the Soviet Union. The recruitment of German scientists and engineers under Operation Paperclip followed similar logic. The United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain competed after the war for German scientific and technical talent, particularly in the areas of rocket technology, aeronautics, and chemical and biological research. The American program eventually brought several hundred German scientists and their families to the United States. where they were employed by the military, by NASA's predecessor organizations, and by defense contractors. Some of these scientists had significant records of wartime complicity in atrocities. Wernher von Braun, who became one of the most celebrated figures in the American space program, had been a member of the SS and had overseen the use of concentration camp slave labor in the production of the V-2 rocket at the Mittelwerk facility. The conditions at Mittelwerk were lethal. The death rate among the prisoners who produced the rockets was extremely high. This was known to American authorities, who reviewed von Braun's record before admitting him to the paperclip program. The decision was made that his technical value outweighed the complications of his record. Von Braun became a public figure in post-war America. He appeared on television. He consulted on the Disney science programs. He was the visible face of American ambition in space. The record of his wartime activities was not publicly discussed during his lifetime in any serious or sustained way. The institutional decision to use him was an institutional decision to manage his record as a problem of public relations rather than as a question of accountability. And the management worked for the duration of his public career because the institutions that had made the decision had the resources and the authority to implement it. The war ended officially in Europe on May 8, 1945, and in the Pacific on September 2, 1945. The instruments of surrender were signed. The military operations ceased. The administrative machinery of demobilization and reconstruction began to operate. Millions of soldiers were processed out of the military, given their discharge papers, their back pay, their medals, and their separation documents, and sent home to a civilian world that was waiting to absorb them and to return to normal. The systems that had enabled the war, the institutional structures, the administrative apparatus, the procurement networks, the intelligence organizations, the research programs, and the industrial capacity that had been built and directed toward destruction did not end with the war. They were reorganized. Some were reduced. Some were retained in their wartime form under new names and new administrative frameworks. Some were transferred, along with their personnel, into the institutional structures of the Cold War that began almost before the Hot War was fully over. The people who had built and operated the wartime systems brought their expertise and their institutional knowledge into the new systems and applied it to new objectives. The transition was not a break. It was a continuation with modifications. The soldiers who came home came back to a country that wanted, with an urgency that was itself a form of institutional demand, to be done with the war, to have it be over, to have it be resolved, to have it produce a clear meaning and a clear end state that could be celebrated and then placed in the past. The men who came home understood, many of them, that the war had not been resolved in the way that this demand required, that it had ended without ending, that the systems that had made it possible were still in place, reorganized and redirected, but fundamentally intact, operating now in the quieter mode of the Cold War, but capable, as they had always been capable, of the same outcomes if directed accordingly. Some of these men said this to the people who would listen. Most did not. Most went back to their lives and were absorbed by the ordinary requirements of daily existence, by work and family, and the specific textures of post-war American life, and the war receded into the background of their experience, present but not discussed, known but not spoken, carried forward into a future that had been built on its foundation without fully acknowledging what that foundation was.